Girl's father realized that the two of them couldn't get out and run away from these monsters, so he was determined to sacrifice himself for his daughter. He knew he had no chance of winning, but he could buy her some precious time to escape. His daughter's name was Evil, and he asked her with all his determination to keep running to the city where it would be safe while he held back the monsters. But Evil understood the lengths her father was going to for her and didn't want to leave him here to perish. So she tearfully answered him that she couldn't leave him behind and run away herself. Her father insisted, and tried to persuade her. He asked her to obey him, for it was the only way for her to escape. And he had promised her mother before they parted that he would protect his daughter at all costs, and now it was time to pay that price. One of their pursuers, who was a ghost or a demon or some other monster, managed to prepare his spell, Ghost Fire, while the father was trying to convince his disobedient daughter to run away. However, the ghost didn't have time to use it, as the father had something to answer with a powerful shout that since Evil doesn't want to run away, then they should end it all quickly and use his strongest abilities to do so. He swung his huge sword with a wave of energy that went straight into the ghost's spell. Father put all his strength and desperation into this blow, hoping that he could change their situation. And it looked like he had succeeded, because his blow not only cut and destroyed the Ghost Fire, but also cut the ghost that had created the spell in half. It seemed that this was their chance to not only survive, but to win. After all, there were still only a few ghosts left to destroy. But with the ghosts falling down and being chopped in two, something was wrong, and some kind of blue smoke or energy was vaporizing off of them. It looked as if the ghost's body was just a vessel. Once it was destroyed, the contents spewed out. His destruction was noticed by the other ghost, who, although surprised by this turn of events, seemed to have a plan of action for such an eventuality. For the next moment he stretched out his arm in the direction of the falling remains, and they began to be drawn into him like a stream. And the remains were not just pulled into him, but turned him into a boiling and swelling mass, and it seems that even for the ghost this process was incredibly painful, and he let out a scream that was not understandable for mortals. When the scouring was complete, a monster with arms and legs of darkness and two masks on its head with a toothy mouth finally appeared. Evil at this time did not sit idly by and decided to go on the attack with her bow and arrows of energy. She answered her father that no matter what happened she would never leave him alone. Her skill was called Natural Arrow, and her arrow released from her bow in flight turned into several different arrows that flew towards the target on different trajectories. She was aiming at the third ghost, who still hadn't taken part in the battle. However, as it turned out, Evil's arrows couldn't do him any harm and were simply absorbed by his cloak. Her father saw the result of his daughter's attack and told her that there was no way she would be able to deal with the apostles of the Dark Guild, and he didn't know how long he could hold them off, so he once again asked her to leave and hurry up. The ghost who had fended off the arrow attack suddenly prepared for a low start, and from beneath his robe showed his muscular arms, which he used to drive into the ground. His leap was quick, strong, and so swift that the ground where he pushed off cracked and exploded as if something had exploded there. In a moment he was at his father's side and brought his fist up to strike. He barely had time to raise his sword in defense. But it did not help him at all, because the blow was so strong that it flew far across the field and half of his sword was still in place. His father flew across the field until his back hit a huge rock, which almost collapsed from such a powerful blow. It was a very painful landing for the father, and he expectorated blood from the impact. Evil, seeing what happened to her father, cried out in horror. He was still clutching the broken sword in his hand, and despite his wounds told her not to worry about him and instead to get out of here faster. There was also something else going on with the ghosts. After the attack, the last ghost jumped on the two-headed monster. And they all started to melt together, about merging into one big ugly monster. Their combined monster was gigantic, and its arms burned with turquoise flames as it slowly approached the two fugitives with a roar that seemed to have no hope of escape. Evil supported her wounded father and looked up at the monster with horror. She assured her father that she would definitely come home with him, he just needed to hold on, but she didn't believe in her own words and just wanted to comfort her dying father. The monster was becoming more and more of an ugly boiling mass with each passing second as it let out horrifying screams and came closer and closer to its victims. Evil looked up in horror and realized that these were her last moments in life and was already ready to die. The monster raised his flaming hand above them for a blow and was about to finish what he had started as suddenly. You know what they say, for every big fish there's always a bigger fish, and that's what happened here. A colossal foot like a giant column collapsed on the monster and crushed it, leaving no trace of it. Evil and her father were showered with a stream of dust and small stones, but overall they were completely unharmed. However, she was surprised to see a colossal mammoth that was known as Lord Mammoth. He was so huge that his carcass covered the sun. And somewhere high up in the clouds on its head was an ancient temple, ruled by an immortal toad with scrolls scattered around him. But even the toad was not the top of this pyramid. It mentally addressed its elder brother and reported to him that the danger had been destroyed, but the question remained what to do with these two harmless humans. There was a small house on his head. And guess who was in it? Not some twisted hermit, and not Naruto at all. It was Wong Kai. Turns out he was the one who was running this living pyramid, and he told the immortal toad that there was no need to harm these harmless humans, he would take them to his master to deal with them. Evil finally came to her senses. She thought she was having some kind of horrible nightmare because she jumped out of bed and shrieked, "Monster!" But when she opened her eyes and looked around, there was no monster and no one at all. She was alone in the middle of an unusual room. The first thing she thought about was where her father was and what a strange place this was. She didn't remember how she got here. However, she remembered something else and it terrified her. Her father was badly injured, and if he didn't get the treatment he needed in time he would surely die. She mentally asked him to hang in there. She immediately jumped out of bed and ran towards the exit of the house. She opened the door and saw her father and screamed, "Dad!" As it turned out, it was not at all what she expected to see, and a mixture of incomprehension and shame reflected on her face. Her father was the healthiest of the healthy and posed, showing off his muscles and pumped-up body in the morning sunlight. Li Ping was simply delighted and clapped his hands at this. And complimented him that he must have spent a lot of time practicing to look like that. He answered him that as a fitness warrior it was fundamental to him. Only Elizabeth stood aside and didn't seem to share their enthusiasm at all. Li Ping asked if it was really a warrior profession from another world, because it was so cool. Meanwhile, Wong Kai carelessly ran around his master's feet and was happy to please him. But his behavior infuriated Elizabeth, and when she had had enough she kicked the poor dog with force. And he galloped across the field like a pebble on water. Elizabeth had some very nice indoor slippers that did absolutely nothing to stop her from kicking the poor dog very hard. Then she walked up to the frightened dog and angrily asked, "Who told you to bring this riffraff back, you stupid dog?" Wong Kai was upset from such blows and complaints and trembled under Elizabeth's fierce gaze, like a real dog that had wronged its mistress. Li Ping still couldn't admire the warrior's muscles and even went over to touch them. After one touch, he howled in delight, noticing how strong his muscles were. The old warrior was flattered by such attention and admiration, and decided that since Mr. Li Ping liked his body, he would not hide it. And the next moment, he went into 100% battle soul burning mode and his muscles swelled even more, tearing his clothes. And now he was posing in just his underwear in front of Li, whose eyes were burning with excitement, and he was vigorously cheering the performance. Evil finally came to her senses after what she had seen and moved closer. She had one question for her father: what was he doing? He finally noticed her and asked in surprise, "Evil, you finally woke up." To himself he replied that he was just trying to please his saviors. Li, too, couldn't find a way to properly explain what they were doing here, though it was probably impossible in principle. However, the awkward situation, if I may say so, was saved by Elizabeth, who interrupted their conversation and told Evil that since she was awake, it was time for them to get out of here. And moving dangerously close to the frightened girl, she added that she was warning her. She demonstrated her superiority in all areas, if you know what I mean. And said she was the first to arrive, unmistakably implying that she would not tolerate competition. Li tried to ease the tension between the girls and intervened in their conversation. He told Evil that they rarely had guests over, so he invited them to go to the house and continue their conversation there. After inviting the guests into the house, he made them each a cup of tea and invited them to help themselves. He was really sorry that now he had nothing good to offer them in this rural area, only this barley tea that he had made himself. Evil looked at the cup of tea as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world and asked her father if this was the miracle potion he had spoken of that would immediately heal whoever drank it. Upon hearing her words, Lee laughed awkwardly, assuring them that it was an exaggeration, and he then simply gave them some cold water from the well. Elizabeth was sitting next to him, not liking what was going on at all, drinking her cocktail and not at all embarrassed to show her displeasure. She wondered what evil experiment Li Ping had brought these two weak people here for and what he wanted to do with them. Could it damn well mean she alone no longer satisfied him? The old warrior started to make excuses, that he was already unconscious back then before that time and could barely remember the details. And it was like this, Li Ping was working in the field as always and was absolutely happy about it. On such a peaceful and quiet day, there was no sign of trouble. But his calm work was interrupted by Wang Kai, who brought two unconscious people. Li had to do something to help them, but he had only water from the well he had brought with him, so he decided to at least give water to the wounded strangers. As soon as he gave the old man water, he became incredibly strong and his wounds were healed. And now he sat here in his room alive and well and told his daughter that if it had not been for Mr. Li Ping's help, he would probably never have seen her again. She looked at the cup of tea in fascination and asked if they could really drink such a precious thing. Li was really happy that he could help people like that. He replied to them that, they adventurous people talked to him so nicely, although in reality they had absolutely no need to be so polite. They thanked him anyway and started drinking their tea. But as soon as they took the first sip their eyes widened at what they felt. Incredible power and energy filled their bodies and even shone outward through their mouths and eyes. They felt everything that Elizabeth had once felt and it changed her. They felt as if they had been transported to another world, a perfect world for them, where a stand of birds soared above them in the light of the setting sun. It seemed that they were in a human paradise, in white robes in the middle of a field of golden wheat. Happiness and positive emotions overwhelmed them. And tears of joy flowed from their eyes, which could not believe what they saw before them. The old man, who had seen many sorrows and joys in his relatively long life, but had never felt anything like this before, was especially weeping. The flock of birds that circled above them consisted of eagle-like birds, and they majestically and leisurely made circle after circle. The father and daughter just lay on the field and looked up into the beautiful sky, unable to believe that a human being could experience such bliss. They could not see it, but around them on that field there was drawn a mystical sign, definitely not of earthly origin. What's this about aliens anyway? Write your theories in the comments. While their souls were flying somewhere in the clouds of pleasure, their mortal bodies got a significant increase in power, and the old man became an archmage of the 4th level, and evil from a mage of the 1st level became an archmage of the 1st level. When they finally woke up, the old man told his daughter that he felt their magical skill levels had improved and advanced further than ever. Evil replied that not only had that happened, she had even awakened her mother's elf bloodline and had grown elven pointy ears. They sighed tiredly together. After crossing the boundaries of consciousness that tea had opened for them, nothing really mattered to them now. Such a change in their mood strained Li a little. But he noticed their empty cups and happily offered to pour them another cup of his signature tea. Touched to the core by his kindness and the incredible tea, the old man said with tears of joy in his eyes that they had enough, really enough, and could not abuse his kindness any further. The real reason for his refusal was that he really thought Li Ping was a godly person, and was not sure if they could endure another such journey across the boundaries of their minds. Meanwhile, Li sadly agreed, since they didn't want to. And thought that he would really like to serve them drinks and snacks, but Elizabeth had taken and eaten them all, and if he tried to bring any more, it might anger the demon queen. He didn't think so for nothing, for Elizabeth was sitting next to him, sipping her cocktail and thinking that everything except this tea, which she didn't like, belonged exclusively to her and the others shouldn't even think or dream about it. Li apologized to the guests because of the fact that he couldn't offer them anything else. But that was absolutely not the reason they were upset. Li, in order to defuse the atmosphere a little and to get to know his guests better, asked an old man, whose name was Barris, how and why they were attacked. Barris, remembering all the details, tensely answered that as he probably knows himself, it all happened because of the elven blood in Evil's body. Evil did not stay out of the conversation and added that her mother was one of the saintness of the elven race, and she gave birth to her after falling in love with her father, who was a human. But the laws of the elven race forbid intermarriage with other races. Lee was surprised to hear this and asked, "What then is it that the elves were trying to catch them?" But his question was interrupted by Elizabeth, who finished her cocktail and said that it was all nonsense, because the ban on intermarriage between races was cancelled many years ago after the Demon Queen united the whole world. Barris sighed heavily and replied that it was a long story. After Evil's mother was forced to return to the Elf Holy Land, he took Evil with him and hid her from everyone. His words reminded Lee of a story from his home world, Romeo and Juliet. And he still thought that it was the elves who had learned of Evil's existence and sent hunters to catch them. But Barris waved his hands in denial and continued that because of his wife's sacrifice and the fact that she had agreed to return to her people, the elves had decided to leave them alone and spare them. Those who were after them this time were envoys of the Dark Guild from the demon realm. Hearing his words, Lee looked suspiciously at Elizabeth and asked, "Demon realm, Dark Guild, what could that mean?" The second cocktail was not enough to cool the Demon Queen's anger. So she jumped up from the bed and angrily poked him with her finger and asked him what he meant when he said that. Lee, realizing how screwed up he was, desperately started begging her for forgiveness. And surprisingly it worked, and Elizabeth calmly though resentfully sat down on the couch, showing her displeasure with her posture. She asked Barris to explain to her clearly where the Dark Guild came from in the demon dimension and why they were taking over the elves. Barris, with a look of horror on his face, answered her that they say that the Dark Guild is conducting mysterious and mystical human experiments whose purpose is to resurrect the Demon Queen who once united the whole world and whose name was Elizabeth. Evil added that the elves are just one of the materials they use so intensely that even she, who has yet to awaken her elf bloodline, has become their target. Lee and Elizabeth froze in their seats for a moment, not knowing what to answer. But then suddenly Elizabeth jumped up from her seat and grabbed Lee and began to shake him like a rag doll. She warned him not to even think that she didn't know what he was thinking. Poor Lee had to ask her for the second time that evening to calm down and forgive him, but this time he had no idea why. The guests watched the scene and Evil had no idea what they were talking about, but her father told her to shut up and mind her own business. Elizabeth was satisfied with her unconditional dominance over Lee, so she calmed down a bit and turned to the guests. She asked them what earth-shattering changes could have taken place outside in just 1 year. And who told them that the Demon Queen was dead? Barris was surprised at such an answer, and replied, "Wasn't that so?" After all, the Demon Queen Elizabeth had disappeared and had not appeared for over 500 years. If she were alive, she would have returned long ago to rule the world. Hearing this, Lee began to bite his nails with worry. He couldn't believe that 500 years had passed outside while Elizabeth had only lived here for a little over a year. However, little things like time and hundreds of years seemed to be of absolutely no concern to Elizabeth, who continued to sit quietly on the sofa. The only significance to her was, what were the rumors about her death and how did she die? Evil answered that according to ancient literature, the Demon Queen Elizabeth was killed by a legendary hero. But she was interrupted by her father and went on to say for her that legends say that the battle lasted for a month until the legendary hero sacrificed himself to protect the continent of heroes and died with the Demon Queen. When Elizabeth heard this, her eyes flashed with rage and she looked at them with a murderous look and asked them how dare they. The fire in her eyes was no ordinary fire, it was a powerful illusion that anyone who looked into them would fall into. And father and daughter made that mistake. They thought they were on a mountain of skulls and blood, and the same landscape could be seen everywhere around them under the blood moon. They were very scared and didn't realize how they got here. Evil asked her father in a trembling voice, "What is this place?" Her father answered her in horror that it was no illusion at all, it was pure killing intent. But the illusion disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, and they again saw before them the displeased face of Elizabeth, who told them that all these rumors were not true. The realization of such a possibility made the unhappy guests stop everything they could, and they became more like cats frightened by a dog than human beings. They had not even allowed themselves to think that it could be so. Lee saw their confusion and confirmed with a smile that this was the case, because he was the legendary hero, at least that's what the system told him. Words are hard to describe the emotions that the guests were forced to endure, the news one more terrible than the other poured down on them non-stop. And they looked in horror at Elizabeth, who, at first glance, could not be said to have drowned the continent in blood and seized power alone. Lee continued to speak, but with a wary look at Elizabeth that it was her. "It's the demon Queen Elizabeth." Lee even covered his eyes to avoid seeing what was going to happen next. With such news, the guests just went into a blackout from such information overload. They even started foaming from their mouths like rabid animals. Elizabeth, on the other hand, just made a disgruntled face, only she knows why. From her perspective, Lee had set this up on purpose and was now pointing his finger at her, urging the guests to mock her. After all, she was the demon queen imprisoned here, so laugh at her. She couldn't stand such humiliation made up in her own head, so she pounded on the table and startled everyone present. Told everyone she'd had enough. As she walked away under the uncomprehending stares of Lee and Barris, she told them lastly that she wasn't going to entertain them anymore. On the outside she seemed calm enough, though upset. But inside she was furious and even steam was coming out of her ears. She kept repeating to herself that that stinking and mean Li Ping had gotten a lot of nerve. And now she realized, he had saved those people on purpose and only to humiliate her. He had gone too far and she would not forgive him. Immersed in her thoughts, she reached the door and closed it behind her with such force that the whole house shook and the whole wall was covered with cracks. As soon as she left the room, Barris breathed out in relief, thinking to himself that finally this monster in a cute guise was gone. He apologized to Lee for pestering him and bringing more trouble to his house, but he wondered what the legendary hero had in mind for the future. Especially their future. Lee himself had barely recovered from the news of 500 years and Elizabeth's extravaganza of leaving the room and was now holding his hands to his knees, rubbing with fear. He barely managed to squeeze out a reply that he didn't know anything about the future, but first of all they all needed to calm down. But the disturbing thoughts did not leave him. As it turned out, after Elizabeth had broken the time barrier, time here had become chaotic and not synchronized with the rest of the world as he had thought before. Perhaps it would take quite some time. He still couldn't believe that 500 years had passed outside. They spent the rest of dinner in silence and tension until Lee finally realized to send his guests to bed. It was past midnight and a bright month lit up the room through the window. The guests lay on their beds and tried to pretend they were asleep, but they weren't very good at it as they had too much to talk about. Father and daughter were whispering. Evil said that she hadn't expected and still couldn't believe that the truth about the events of 500 years ago would turn out to be so. How could a demon queen fall in love with a legendary hero, leave the whole world at her feet and hide from everyone? Just like they did themselves once upon a time. Her father also whispered back to her that they had no right to compare themselves to them. Mr. Li Ping said to calm down first, and that surely meant that he was pondering how to deal with them, whether to spare them or not. And he advised her not to talk nonsense. But Evil didn't calm down and kept asking, why then did Mr. Li Ping save and heal them if he was going to kill them? Even an old warrior like him, who had seen many things, didn't have an exact answer to such a complex question. But he assumed that just as Li had mundanely helped them make the breakthrough to the advanced stage of magic with his sacred tea and then nearly strangled them by offering a supplement. He thought that for beings of this level, they ordinary mortals were no more than ants, and whether they were spared or killed depended solely on their mood. Suddenly there was a thud of footsteps. It was Lee who had come to check on the sleeping guests. But in the midnight darkness he seemed like a maniac. And his next sentence did not sound as he intended. He asked why they were still awake and what were they doing so late. Poor Evil had tears in her eyes and started to say goodbye to her life. She thought it was the end and he came in a bad mood to deal with those annoying ants he was tired of playing with. And Lee's grin in the dark was really scary, like a villain's. However, when he came closer and the moonlight illuminated him, he was smiling in a friendly way and holding a deck of playing cards. He asked them if they wanted to play cards since they were awake anyway. Barris, who expected a lot, but definitely not this, in a nervous voice and stammering a bit, asked if he really wanted to play cards. It was just like that, and having lit a candle in the room, Lee began to explain them the rules, which they as it turned out did not know. They sat around the candle, and when Lee finished explaining, he asked if they understood everything and looked at his students carefully. Barris answered him with the same look and replied that it was roughly understood. Evil, remembering her father's words, concluded that this game was Mr. Li Ping's test for them, by the results of which he would decide whether to kill them or not. Therefore, she was as focused as possible to win. Li saw the guest's readiness, and said okay then, he will start dealing the cards. Evil nervously swallowed the lump in her throat, as if she was deciding on some deadly trick. Then she asked in a trembling voice, Mr. Li Ping, may I dare to ask, what's the name of this game? She could see the ominous blue aura emanating from those cards with her elven vision, and it made her tense. Such a question surprised Li, and he didn't even know what to say to her. He needed to come up with a name for the game, which in his world was called Fighting the Landlord or Do Diju, so that they would understand and remember it. Such a difficult task stumped him for a few minutes. But he did come up with a name for the game and happily pounded his fist on his hand. He told them to call the game Dragon Fight. But such a name was not received at all as he expected, and only frightened his guests, who were very familiar with dragons and their power. As it turned out, they were not alone in the room, and Elizabeth was spying on them using her high-level magic concealment technique. She looked like a cute little ghost with wings, and it was also the first time she had heard of a game like Dragon Fight. She looked down at the players and couldn't figure out what that sneaky Lee was up to this time. Meanwhile, he was trying to explain the game. Which was that two brave heroes, that is them, had to join forces to defeat the dragon. Who would be the hero and who would be the dragon depended on the cards they drew and on the strength of their set of cards. Then he asked them if they understood everything or should he repeat it again. The father and daughter looked at each other nervously, and Barris replied that of course that was enough and this was a test for them. It seemed to them that Lee was really a sick maniac who had decided to play cards on their lives. And now with a sly smile said that he was about to deal them cards and reminded them to think things through well before choosing. The Real Lee looked at his cards with a good-natured smile and advised them to hurry or he would take the best of them. Barris turned to his daughter and said, Evil, there is no room for hesitation now and she should take her cards. Poor Evil had no choice but to agree. She reached out her hand to the cards, which she thought were surrounded by electric shocks. As soon as she touched the cards, she and her father were suddenly transported to another dimension where they were sitting in the middle of some huge dark lake, but not drowning in it. Barris looked around and didn't know how they could have traveled to another dimension so quickly. However, even stranger things were happening to Evil, who was forced to lean on the floor with her hands. She had spent all her magical power just picking her cards and was now barely hanging on. She realized that she couldn't go on any longer and needed a break. She turned to her father and told him that she was sorry to let him down, but she couldn't go on any longer. Barris, seeing his daughter's condition, reassured her that everything was fine and advised her to leave the rest for him. He would sort it out. Lee didn't notice how difficult the game was for his guests and was looking at his cards with fascination. He asked them if any of them wanted to be a dragon. He had a very nice set of cards in his hand, even though he didn't have many big cards in it. He also had big kings and small kings. It was not bad and he had a good chance of winning. The scared father and daughter turned down the offer to be a dragon. They looked at their cards and still couldn't figure out if their cards were strong or not. Lee looked at his cards and realized that if he could draw 1 4 and 2 aces from the deck, he could win and was ready to take the risk. He asked them again if they wanted to be a dragon and they shook their heads vigorously in the negative. Lee had no choice but to be a dragon in this game and he was fine with that. He warned them that he would not be polite. Then he reached out his hand and took the top 3 cards from the deck. He flipped them over and threw them into the middle of their makeshift circle. To his dismay, there wasn't what he wanted to see there. Lee looked at the cards with a sad face. What a disappointment. However, the guests completely misunderstood his emotions and were terrified to think that he might be beaming with displeasure at their performance. The game continued and Lee was about to play an 8. After his move, it was Barris' turn, who was pensively looking at his cards and pondering that if they successfully passed this difficult test, Mr. Li Ping would surely spare them, so they could not afford to give up. But as soon as he bit down on one card to play it, he felt something. It turns out that every time he played a card, it cost him his life force. That didn't stop him, he was determined, he thought, to survive at all costs and played the Jack card. His finger he used to hold the card before throwing it wrinkled like dried up. Evil was shocked at what happened to her father's finger, it seemed to have aged 40 years and belonged to a very old man. But Barris was a true warrior and was not going to give up so easily. He told his daughter that he was fine and could handle everything. Evil, seeing the desperate determination on her father's face, didn't dare to contradict him and agreed to give up in this round. Meanwhile, Lee looked at his cards and realized that he was not doing as well as he would like, and if he responded to Barris' move now, he would most likely be at a disadvantage. So he decided to fold as well. Barris was shocked at this turn of events. How could a legendary hero pass? He decided to interrogate if he really didn't want to answer. And Lee nonchalantly replied that he did. Barris was horrified by such a choice of the legendary hero. It seemed to him that he had finally realized Lee's intention, which was to purposely make him continue playing cards by absorbing his life force. He thought that in such a situation, the best solution for him would be to get rid of all his cards as fast as possible. So he played 8 cards at once, the combination of which was called Flying Dragon. Barris put these cards in front of Lee and confidently said that according to the rules, this combination of cards is called Flying Dragon. However, as soon as he played the cards, he realized with horror what the price was. He grabbed his foot and saw that the same thing had happened to it that had happened to his toe before. He now realized that the greater the power of the cards he played, the greater the price he paid for it. As it turned out, the combination, the Flying Dragon, was called that for a reason, for after the combination was played a blue dragon of energy appeared above them. Evil and Barris almost lost their jaws and eyes in surprise when they saw the dragon. The dragon was truly intimidating and was preparing his attack by gathering a blob of energy in front of his mouth. Once it was ready, it shot a beam of energy directly at Lee. Evil and Barris were simply petrified with fear. Elizabeth's ghost, on the other hand, watched it all with indifference, not showing any emotion. The dragon after its attack began to disappear as suddenly as it had appeared. Barris was horrified. He didn't know it would turn out like this. As it turned out, the fact that he played a combination of cards led him to a losing situation, not in the game, but in life. And now he is doomed, because he just offended the legendary hero and now he is sure to die. But Lee didn't seem to notice the dragon's attack, and the blue flame that was still burning on him didn't seem to bring him any discomfort either. He continued to study his cards intently. And then finally said that it was well played. Barris was confused and didn't realize whether to rejoice or cry, but just in case he suggested that Lee start the next round. But Lee replied with a smile that he didn't want to, and exactly the same suggestion was made to Barris. He realized that it was pointless to resist and agreed to start and began to look at his cards tensely. Then he played a 3 of spades, for which he immediately paid with another finger. Evil, as always before, passed, and now Lee said that his turn now played a 10. As it turned out, his opponents had nothing to answer. He was just waiting for this, and a smug smile played on his face. He went on and played straight. They were all immediately surrounded together by streams of energy forming a circle around them. A large wave appeared and immediately rushed towards them. Barris only had time to scream in fear when a wave called Sky-Destroying Wave came over them. The wave hit them, nearly washing them away, and Barris shouted to his daughter to hold on. But there was so much water that it covered them and they began to sink, gasping for air. When it seemed to them that everything and now they were going to drown, the water suddenly disappeared and they began to breathe convulsively, greedily grabbing air with their mouths. Evil exclaimed that she couldn't play this anymore. Lee seemed not to notice the despair of his guests and continued to play as if nothing had happened. Next he played 3 of a kind with a pair, and he was immediately surrounded by streams of blue energy. But this time the attack was different, not a dragon or a wave. It was a battle chariot that was already on its way to attack. Barris could not respond in any way and was already preparing for another beating, but then Evil intervened and asked to wait. She was determined to help her father and now she had the right cards to do so. Her father asked her not to do it because she would then have to pay for drawing the cards with her life force. But that didn't stop her and she replied that she couldn't hide behind his back forever and now it was her time to protect him. She also, like Lee, played three of a kind with a pair. But because of her elven blood she didn't age like her father, instead she spent her magical power. And now two chariots appeared above them and with a fierce shout rushed one upon the other. In the next moment the chariots collided and there was an explosion in the place of their collision, coloring everything around in turquoise tones. But as soon as the smoke from the explosion cleared, Lee's chariot came out of there unharmed, shining with a bright turquoise light. Barris and Evil froze, unable to believe what had happened. When they came to their senses, Barris immediately turned to his daughter and asked if she was all right. She frowned her eyebrows at the protagonist and told her father in a firm voice that she was fine. Lee with a smile on his face turned to the father and daughter and said that even if they lost their cards at the right moment, they still had to protect their teammates, also adding that the most important thing was their determination and teamwork. At the same time, he thought to himself in surprise that he didn't expect that they would understand the essence of this game of cards so quickly and would even be able to impose a good competition on him. Barris heard his words about determination and looked questioningly at his hand with two dried-up fingers. He wondered what he really meant. But then Lee suddenly looked at his cards, solemnly announced that it was all just too late. He was absolutely sure of his victory. Evil and Barris didn't understand what was going on and looked at him in despair. Even Elizabeth realized that something was about to happen and she had a bad and ominous feeling about the whole thing. Lee pulled out two of his cards. And with a smug smile placed two jokers on the floor at once. Immediately afterward, the ceiling above them shone with a blue light and a huge crack appeared. The father watched in horror, not knowing what kind of terrible creature would appear from there. From the crack appeared large hands with long claws, which began to widen the crack. Until finally a hideous-looking jester or clown with bells on his hat could squeeze in and with his toothy smile scared the hell out of Evil and Barris. And even Elizabeth was shocked by the creature that Lee had summoned and the censorious words she lacked to express her emotions. As it turned out, it was a supreme clown king who was also a 3-star demon level, and he was already reaching out his clawed hand to the frightened victims. But suddenly, he stopped and summoned a cute heart. However, he never did anything with it since that got his attention. On the other hand, he looked directly at Elizabeth and asked what she was staring at. After a moment he turned the heart in his hands into a knife. And turning to Elizabeth he advised her to be careful as he might just kill her. He licked his knife viciously and bloodily to confirm his words. She was furious and asked him who he thought he was looking at. She was preparing a spell to show him who he was messing with. She, being a demon queen, had already lost her honor by losing once and had taken the humiliation of being imprisoned for over a year for a hero to feed her. All this to barely reach the level of a 3-star demon god. Now she couldn't believe that the legendary hero had so easily and casually summoned a rival equal to her in a game with mere mortals. Meanwhile, father and daughter had already come to terms with their fate and Barris begged forgiveness in his daughter for being powerless. She sadly answered him that he could not blame himself, for it was all her fault, she herself had annoyed Mr. Li Ping. But suddenly Barris coughed up blood and was horrified to feel the life force draining out of him at a maddening pace. Hardening himself he placed his cards on the floor without even realizing what he was doing. Lee finally noticed the distress of his guests and asked if they were all right. He figured it was all because their injuries from the demon attack still hadn't healed. Then he looked down at the cards that Barris had placed. It seemed to Lee that Barris could have won a lot of time ago and was just letting him play with it. Now he seemed so naive and stupid to himself for thinking he was good at this game. But really just disturbed the rest of his guests. With such sad thoughts, he began to pick up the cards scattered on the floor. And his horrible summoned clown immediately vaporized. Lee gathered all the cards back into the deck. And stood up and thanked the guests for the game and the fun and advised them to get a good night's rest. And frustrated, he headed out of the room apologizing for the inconvenience. The father and daughter were really surprised and puzzled. They couldn't believe that they were still alive. And now they knew for sure that this legendary hero would be very difficult indeed for them to understand him if at all possible. Elizabeth on the other hand had her own worries. She was furious. How outrageous it was to her that even playing cards with these two people, the legendary hero's real plan was to find an opportunity to attack the Demon Queen. The next morning the guests wished to go on their way without any delay and without breakfast. Lee thought this strange, and asked them if they would like to stay a couple of days longer, for the fruit he had planted was almost ripe, and he planned to give them a banquet. But Barris bowed to him in return and said that they could not occupy the two of them any longer. And Lee's kindness and favor would never be forgotten by them. Lee was surprised at such gratitude and asked them not to make things so serious. Before leaving, Barris assured them that after they left they would keep their secret and absolutely wouldn't say anything to anyone. Evil asked if Lee really wanted to give them such a valuable gift. She had a white tea box in her hands. But Lee cheerfully assured them that it was just regular barley tea and he would really like them to take it with them. As it turned out, the gifts didn't end there and Lee put something else in Barris' hand, saying that it would be a memento of him to them. It was the deck of cards they had played with last night. Barris was surprised at such a valuable and dangerous gift. Horrible memories of last night flew before his eyes. But Lee had insisted and asked him to take them. For as it turned out, his card-playing skills were too bad and they were totally unsuitable for him. But his self-abuse was interrupted by the exclamation of Elizabeth, who had been standing nearby all this time. Barris heard her voice and was startled. Elizabeth told them to hurry up and get out of here. This seemingly short phrase had a lightning effect, and in a moment the guests were left with only a streak of dust, which they raised, fleeing at top speed away. Lee didn't even have time to say goodbye to them. He stared at them questioningly, not realizing what had happened. As soon as the guests disappeared over the horizon, Elizabeth turned around and went into the house, saying that now that everything was back to normal, Lee should go and cook a lot of food for his queen. The poor man had no choice but to agree. Barris was desperately dragging Evil by the arm, eager to get away from that cursed place where the two super creatures were playing their strange games. Poor Evil got dizzy from running so fast and asked her father to stop for a moment, because she couldn't take it anymore. Barris himself was tired and finally slowed down sharply. He tried to catch his breath, and he could hardly do it after such an intense run. Still trying to catch his breath, he remembered the events of last night, the worst night of his life, first the test in the form of a game from a legendary hero, and then the threats from the Demon Queen. The memories of last night flashed before his eyes, when right after the legendary hero had left them to rest, Elizabeth appeared to them in all her glory. Without saying anything and looking at them with a murderous stare from which they could not move, she made a sharp movement with her hand, as if she wanted to cut something off. And she drew her hand straight across the neck of the guests, and in the darkness it seemed that this red line cut off their heads. The father and daughter immediately grabbed their throats, trying to breathe while their necks burned with fire. They were unharmed, but they were wearing seals, in an unknown language that looked like thin collars. Immediately after that, Elizabeth addressed them in a threatening tone and ordered them to leave this place tomorrow, and they were obliged not to reveal any information about her, that is, the Demon Queen and the legendary hero, especially about their presence in this world. It was an order that could not be disobeyed. And Barris with a pathetic look answered for both of them that they understood everything and they would not dare to disobey Her Majesty's order. But for Elizabeth their words were not enough, and she told them that if they had even the slightest idea of going against her will, the accursed seal around their necks would immediately behead them. Returning from his memories, Barris concluded that the truth of the whole story was that the Demon Queen who ruled the entire world and the legendary hero Li Ping were tired of the worldwide conflict between good and evil and now didn't want anyone to bother them. As he spoke, Evil looked around and noticed that the place looked familiar. Barris didn't believe her at first and wrapped his own head around it. And then seeing the huge footprints and demon prints, he asked in surprise if he had run this far. It was exactly where they had fought their pursuers last time. Watching them from far away was Wang Kai, who thought that sending them here should stop them from pestering the master and that fierce woman forever. It turns out that it wasn't actually Barris who was running so fast out of fear, but Wang Kai was helping him a lot, in a way that he didn't even realize. Evil and Barris stood in front of the giant mammoth's footprints and saw the corpses of the Dark Guild apostles that were still here. Barris sensed with one spot that there was something wrong here and there might be high-level demons nearby, so they needed to leave this place as quickly as possible. Wang Kai also sensed that something was approaching. But he was in absolutely no mood to help them again, so he opened the portal and thought that no one cared what happened to them, so he would rather go back home and get beaten up by that fierce woman. And he immediately jumped into his portal, leaving no trace behind. Meanwhile, Evil and Barris were already surrounded by many dark-cloaked figures. But this time there was one demon who stood out among them, and now he was laughing gloatingly while the other low-ranked demons were making incomprehensible noises, either laughing or just intimidating their victims. Barris was horrified to recognize that demon as the Great Apostle. It was the first time Evil had heard of him and did not fully understand the danger they were in. The Great Apostle of the Dark Guild continued to laugh and pointed his finger directly at the two victims in front of him. Immediately, a multitude of high-level spirit demons rushed to attack. The father and daughter were very frightened, for the difference in their strength and levels was very significant. Evil realized that they had no chance in the battle and suggested to her father to run and she would stay and buy him time. But he had a plan to solve everything, for despite the large gap in their strength, now after seeing the measurement of the strength of those two, all those apostles seemed nothing in comparison. Barris took out a deck of cards from which streams of blue energy began to emanate and announced to everyone that now everyone would call him the hero with a heart of iron. The streams of energy from the deck threw back the attacking apostles. The Great Apostle did not expect such resistance. Barris, feeling the power in his hands, told Evil that ever since her mother had returned to her elven tribe, he had taken complete care of her and had become very timid so as not to attract unnecessary attention. But now he knew he was wrong and just running away wouldn't solve the problem, and now with this power, if they survived and got through this difficulty, he would take Evil to the elven tribe and take her mother back to reunite their family. Next he squeezed the deck of cards in his hands harder. And 4 cards flew out of it, surrounded by green energy. It was a summoning card. This combination of cards allowed him to use a technique called 4 Bombs of God Arrow Indulgence. The majestic image of Evil's mother appeared above him. And she, unable to believe her eyes, could not take her gaze off of her. Barris gathered all the energy in front of him and shouted that now he would play his card. The image of Evil's mother caught a bundle of green energy and formed it into a bow and arrow. The arrow flew at an incredible speed, slicing through the air with a whoosh. One of the demons only had time to shriek. In the next instant, the arrow began to pierce through the demons' heads one by one. It didn't fly just straight, but zigzagged, leaving no chance for the demons to dodge. When the last demon spirit was defeated, the arrow flew straight at their leader, the Great Apostle, who did not even make an attempt to dodge, confident in his strength and invulnerability. As the arrow flew toward him, he stopped it with one hand with a smug smile. But when he felt its power, his smile immediately changed to a nervous one. He immediately tried to hold the arrow with both hands, chafing and chuckling in panic. But he never managed to contain that power, and the arrow pierced the head of the last enemy on the battlefield. Barris carefully stacked the cards back into the deck. The image of his wife began to fade with them. Finally he could relax a little, and immediately his strength failed him and he fell to his knee. His daughter immediately ran up to him. After a little breathing he said that it looked like he should change his profession. Father and daughter sat in the middle of the field near the ditch that the arrow had left behind. The power of this attack was incredible, and at the same time, it didn't require boundless strength from the one who used it. Just like that, from that moment onwards, a new profession called Card Master appeared on the hero continent. A week later, Lee was sitting in the shade of a tree near his house, enjoying the fruits of his labor. On the table in front of him were sliced watermelon slices. As he ate the delicious watermelon, he thought about how wonderful the magical world was. Almost anything was possible here, and even his personal method of plant crossbreeding was successful. He was able to grow many different fruits and berries on one plant. But he was missing something, because without the opportunity to share the results of his labor and harvest, he felt empty and that something was missing. In this world he had the opportunity to become anything he wanted, a warrior, an archer, a mage, even a servant of the demon queen, but he chose to remain an ordinary farmer in the village of newcomers. And up until this point, it had seemed to him from the beginning that he would always be satisfied with peaceful farming. But now that he had everything and had some contact with the outside world through guests, his heart couldn't find peace. Now he wanted to see that outside world. Lee sighed, realizing that all people are like that and he is no different from them. When they get something they then immediately want two more and so on. Unfortunately, he couldn't go to the outside world as he was too weak, so he should forget about it. Suddenly, a small pop occurred near him. When the smoke from it cleared, there was Elizabeth, who teleported here from the house without getting up from her chair. She asked our hero what was on his mind. After all, he had been looking rather sad lately. Lee replied that he would like to go out into the outside world, but he was too weak to do so. Elizabeth laughed at his words and remarked that he was finally anxious to leave this place. Well, she could help him and he could travel with her. She thought to herself that the outside world was simply not comparable to his world, and his attempt to make himself a defenseless victim was too arrogant. Lee glowed with happiness. He couldn't believe she was offering to help him. He thought that with the demon queen and her protection it would be a completely different story and he would be safe. Elizabeth responded to all this by finishing her cocktail. And advised him to cut the crap and go change. 10 minutes later they were already fully prepared for their trip. Lee finally changed his work attire and now he did not look like a peasant from a distant village. Elizabeth had also dressed up, all the clothes Lee had made for herself and him. And now the demon queen was forced to notice that his cooking and sewing skills were very impressive. They stood together admiring their new look. Lee replied that it was indeed true, as those were his main specialties, cooking and sewing. Watching this sweet couple even Wang Kai barked with delight. Elizabeth snapped her fingers. Immediately, a portal called Transfer Door appeared in front of them. Elizabeth explained that by going through it they could get to the nearest town. Lee was surprised and remarked what a handy skill this was. Elizabeth was not going to hesitate and headed for the portal. But Lee stopped her, asking her to wait and answer a few questions. He was a little scared to ask them, but he still dared to. He wanted to know for sure that once they got to the outside world, would Elizabeth leave him alone? Would she be able to keep her emotions in check? And could she not use her power to its fullest? But as always Elizabeth understood everything in her own way and it seemed to her that these were not questions but orders for her. In which he forbade her to leave him without permission, ordered her to control her temper and not to use magic carelessly so as not to spoil his fun of socializing with ordinary people. She replied with a stony face that she understood. But that was not the end of his questions and the main question that bothered him was, would she come back here with him when she saw the changes outside? Lee was very worried that now that the protective barrier of the newcomer village was gone without the protection of the demon queen, it would very quickly become food for the demonic creatures that were prowling around. Elizabeth replied that of course she would come back here. She thought to herself that before she officially defeats this evil legendary hero, the outside world means nothing to her. Lee was glad to hear such good news. But Elizabeth had conditions too. He had to agree to just one request of hers. Lee asked fearfully what was the request. Imagining what she might want in return. She stepped closer to him. And asked that when they returned he have something ready for her. A super deluxe assorted fruit pudding. Lee interjected in surprise, pudding. Elizabeth confirmed that was exactly what it was and asked if he had any problem with that. An overjoyed Lee replied that of course not, go ahead. And they walked through the portal together leaving poor Wang Kai alone. He only had time to bark goodbye to them. It was Lee's first trip through the portal, and it wasn't the most pleasant, but it was fast. He squinted at the bright light. Then he looked around in surprise. There was a beautiful and colorful medieval city with a large castle in the center. It was a neutral town on the outskirts of the continent of heroes. It was called Boaster, and from afar it looked peaceful and prosperous. At first glance, it looked like humans and monsters were living peacefully side by side. Lee glowed with happiness and marveled at how amazing this place was, as if he had stepped into another world. Elizabeth didn't share his admiration and just looked around. First Lee noticed the gear store with helmets, shields and armor. Then to a butcher's shop selling ingredients, but what surprised him it was the carcass of an ordinary pig on the counter. So he bounced from one store to another each time marveling at everything like a little child. Elizabeth stood motionless in the middle of the market and noticed that 500 years had passed quite unnoticed and the changes in the outside world did not seem so significant. After the market they went on to look around the city and Lee said that it seemed to him that the world around them was not as chaotic as Uncle Barris had told them. Elizabeth closed her eyes with a smug smile and said that it was all thanks to her, for she had laid a strong foundation during her reign. In the beginning in this world, various forces were in conflict and the situation was chaotic. But thanks to the fact that she used her absolute power to suppress them all, she managed to establish a set of rules where absolutely everyone was equal. So it was her who saved the world, not Lee, the so-called hero. After finishing her monologue, she finally opened her eyes and looked at the place where the hero should have been. But he wasn't there, which made Elizabeth very angry and she clenched her fists. She thought it was nonsense that he didn't even pay attention to her past accomplishments and instead went to look at the counter with the dolls. Another humiliation for her from a legendary hero. Meanwhile, Lee was looking at the homemade dolls for sale, bunnies and bears. He especially liked the way they were made and asked the girl who was selling them if she had made them herself. The girl with the glasses replied that yes, and if he liked them so much, she could offer him a lower price than usual. But their sweet conversation was interrupted by the rude shouting of a boorman who asked who gave them permission to set up shop here. Then with a single kick of his foot he threw over the crate on which the toys were stacked, and they flew in all directions. The pig-headed bandit grabbed the poor girl by the arm and called her a stinker, adding that her church owed his gang protection money and had never paid. How dare she set up shop in his place after that? Apparently that Annie girl was the oldest among the orphans some church had taken care of, and she was selling homemade dolls to further provide for her younger siblings. Several of them were with her now and watched with horror and tears in their eyes the outrage of the bandit, who grabbed the girl by the scruff of the neck and lifted her above the ground, but even in this position, she boldly answered him that their gang had never protected them, so why should they pay them for protection? Such a statement made the bandit angry and he called her an idiot, because since last month this whole street had become their territory and had come under the control of the Beast Gang. And now if she wanted to survive here, she would have to pay them a ransom every month. The girl desperately replied to him that none of this was true and the church belonged to the nun, not them. And when she returned, their gang would be in trouble. Lee watched everything in rage but did nothing about it yet. The boorman continued to threaten the girl by telling her that she was uneducated and didn't understand anything about the situation. For that he would so and so throw all the orphans away and raze that broken church to the ground. Lee finally couldn't stand it any longer and shouted at him to stop. The bandit, not believing his ears, turned to see who was so brave and stupid and asked him what he was going to do to stop him. Lee immediately lost his fervor and began to stammer, unable to say anything intelligible. Elizabeth looked at him askew and thought that he minded his own business. She did not understand why he wanted to play with these ordinary people again. But for Lee everything looked completely different, and he looked pleadingly at Elizabeth for help and support. She turned away from him proudly and unapproachably, unwilling to stoop to his level. Not getting a clear answer, the bandit began to get furious and repeated his question, asking what intentions our hero has. Lee in horror grabbed his head, not knowing what to do. But then he came up with a brilliant, as it seemed to him, idea. And he immediately decided to realize it. He pointed his finger at the bandit and loudly urged the whole crowd of citizens to come and condemn this pig-headed man for bullying a little girl. But as it turned out no one wanted to help him and everyone pretended not to hear anything. Absolutely nothing was seen or heard. The bandit only laughed at his pathetic attempt and asked if he really thought anyone would come to his aid. Everyone on this street knew the Beast Gang, and no one wanted to mess with them. The pig-headed man looked suspiciously at the hero's clothes and made the assumption that he was a foreigner from the south. But then grinned nastily at the protagonist's companion and said she wasn't bad. Frightened Lee offered to discuss everything. After all, he has several valuable items of his own production in his backpack, and he could share with them. But this arrangement did not suit the bandits, who appeared from the crowd and now approached the protagonist. The pig-headed man ordered them to undercut all their goods, beat the insolent man, and seize the woman and drag her to their lair and lock her up there. Elizabeth, though she was in Lee's imaginary captivity, but now she asked the approaching bandits with a cocky smile if they really thought there was anyone capable of imprisoning her in a dungeon. So they were really stepping on the tail of the tiger. Just then, pink clouds with lightning bolts covered the sky over the town and Elizabeth's evil smile appeared in the sky. The bandits were frightened and did not understand why the weather had changed so dramatically. And not only them, all the townspeople were terrified of what was happening in the sky. They all wondered what or who could have caused Armageddon on their heads so suddenly. Lee asked Elizabeth not to do that, not to destroy the whole town. He tried to calm her down as much as he could and asked her to calm down because she had scared them enough already. She doesn't really want to fight ordinary people, does she? Finally Elizabeth exhaled and replied that okay, she would spare them all, but only because he asked. Elizabeth's magical power was immense compared to the rest of the residents, and this was noticed by the orphan girl Annie, who seemed to have her own unique abilities. She could see what the others couldn't and was surprised to see such power. Meanwhile, the bandits noticed that the clouds were beginning to part and wondered if it would finally rain today or not.